In May 2021, however, the Delta variant, which is causing a new wave of infections across the world, breached these defenses, resulting in the first airport cluster. In response, Jewel was immediately closed and public access to the airport terminals were restricted. Jewel reopened on the 14th of June this year, but the airport terminals remain closed to members of the public. The Ministry of Health monitors the public health situation overseas and assesses the appropriate risk level, taking into consideration information from the WHO, experts and academic networks, as well as Singapore missions overseas. Depending on how the risk profile changes, CAAS and our aviation stakeholders then promptly adjust their protocols. Hence, in consultation with MOH and the National Centre for Infectious Diseases, NCID, we further tightened our measures based on our understanding of the Delta variant. Beyond the earlier passenger segregation measures, the airport itself is now segregated into physical zones. Disembarkation piers, toilets, arrival immigration halls, and baggage claim belts are now separate for passengers from places of different risks. Changi now also processes passengers from very high-risk places at dedicated bus gates at Terminal 2, which is currently closed for renovation. These passengers are then transported directly to their SHN dedicated facilities. We do not allow transfer passengers from these very high-risk places, and Changi is also studying the option of using Terminal 4 for such passengers. So our top priority is to keep our airport workers safe, thereby also protecting their families and the wider community. They are at the heart of Changi Airport's operations and at the front lines of our border defenses. Hence, we have prioritized our aviation workers for vaccination, and today, 95% of frontline aviation workers are fully vaccinated. From the onset of COVID-19, MOT and CAAS have worked with MOH and NCID to ensure that airport workers don the appropriate level of personal protective equipment and undergo regular testing based on their job function. In response to the Delta variant, we have stepped up the PPE posture for airport workers and implemented more frequent routine testing. Within the higher risk zones, workers are also cohorted and have separate toilet, dining, and rest facilities.
The first is really to ask if intermingling between passengers from arriving from countries with different risk levels associated with them was allowed prior to mid-May 2021, and if so, what was the thinking behind that, and what were the lessons drawn from that? Now, of course, there's physical segregation, but to what extent was intermingling within the airport permitted? And the context for that is really anecdotal feedback that there was such intermingling being seen. Whether that is accurate or not, I'm not sure, and that's why I'm asking the SQ. And with your permission, Mr. Speaker, sir, may I quote very briefly from a Straits Times Forum letter from someone in April that gained some wide circulation? Very briefly.
Proceed, please.
Yes, so this letter writer in April said, and I quote, "Much to my dismay, inbound passengers were allowed to roam freely upon landing. One was free to hang around in the terminal between departure gates for as long as one wanted, rather than being sent straight to swab testing. I observed similar unregulated processes at the baggage claim area long before passengers were funneled to the stations, and so on and so forth." And this was from April, of course. So now, of course, we've had that physical segregation. So I just wanted to ask whether that was the case, what was the thinking behind that, what were the lessons drawn from that. A second supplementary question is just, what are the criteria that the government uses to classify countries into different risk levels, and does that take into account the extent of vaccination? Thank you.
On the second point first, the risk assessment and categorization is undertaken by the Ministry of Health. So I would not want to represent the overall thinking on behalf of the ministry and its experts, but I would say that the officials, the experts take into account a gamut of factors, and it's also an evolving set of factors. And I think the state of vaccination is certainly one of the considerations, but is by no means the only one, as the member would well appreciate. Secondly, on the point about intermingling and what was the thinking, etc., as I explained in some detail in my response to the member's question earlier, the starting point must be that we are undertaking measures based on a detailed risk assessment. And that risk assessment is informed by as up-to-date an understanding as we have of the virus, its characteristics, its transmission nature, and also how these are changing with new variants emerging. And therefore, this is a risk-adjusted approach, and it has to be so, because as we have observed around the world, really hardly any country so far has been spared the Delta variant, regardless of the posture they take. What we need to do is ensure that the posture we adopt and the measures that we adopt respond promptly to the latest understanding and address the risks that are posed in a dynamic situation with equally dynamic responses. So in that context, prior to the latest set of measures and the physical segregation that I talked about, we had progressively instituted a series of measures which I have just elaborated, so I don't propose to repeat them. Now, there may well have been some intermingling, but that was not something that was encouraged. It was actually generally designed for people to move from the aircraft to the immigration process, collect their baggage and exit. Now, I also want to emphasize to the member what we have undertaken in Changi now with physical segregation of the airport is really turning the operating model on its head. And I hope we all appreciate that. Because civilian airports, as we might recall from a not too distant past, are designed for passengers to come in and to actually have an experience at the airport, what we call the Changi experience. So when we now say passengers are completely segregated physically in different zones, and their movement from aircraft to immigration, to customs, to baggage collection, to transportation, etc., and we add now testing, is a completely different model. And so we must appreciate that every move like this that we make entails significant adjustments, not just from an operational point of view, but also in terms of the burden it imposes on the workers at the airport. So I want to emphasize that a point that I made earlier, but I think it bears emphasis again, which is that we want to do everything we can to ensure the safety of our passengers, our aviation workers, their families, and through that, the larger community. But we also want to ensure that the measures we take reflect our best judgment of the risks based on an evolving situation, and we ensure to the best of our ability that we respond in a manner that addresses those risks.